Welcome to the Escape News Podcast. I'm your host, Chad.
And I'm your co-host, Ryan.
Thanks for joining us today. And today we'll be talking about Soviets and UBI. Those, not directly, not in that, I guess in that order, but not necessarily that Soviets had UBI.
Right.
But, every time we come up with, so Ryan wanted to talk about universal basic income, which is UBI. And so I was like, well, I'll find something somewhat related. And in my mind, looking up socialism or the Soviet era was kind of related, even though most people, when you're looking up the resources about like UBI and socialism, they say this is not the same thing. It's not similar at all. And by definition, I guess it's not the same. But in theory, to me, it works out that like you're taking money from one people or some people and giving it to other people feels like the same kind of ideology to me, at least. So not necessarily socialism by definition. So here's the definition of socialism before we go forward talking about the Soviet era. A political and economic theory of social organization which advocates that the means of production, and this is the big thing, is the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. And in most cases, when it's a socialist country, that community, it means the state, like the communal gathering of all the people who form the government, basically. And then if you go to like Lenin and Stalin and all the people who believed in socialism, they believed from a humanitarian standpoint, not humanitarian, but like a humanist standpoint, that humans are good and that socialism would eventually become communism, where everything is collectively owned, the collective ownership of everything, the means, the production, the distribution, all things are for the common good, and humans would just naturally be selfless and give and receive gratefully and not have any infighting or greed or jealousy or whatsoever. And that's not the case. So with the Soviets, when they fell apart, in my research, it's interesting to see that, like, contrary to our popular opinion for the Western agenda, socialism over there was actually kind of like a good thing. It was for the workers' rights, because prior to that you had the czars and all these kind of like a king queen setup that, give me all your lands and peoples and I'll live in my wonderful palace while these people starve and don't really actually make anything of their lives. And so for a lot of the people in Soviet or in Russia at that time, when they moved over to socialism, it actually was kind of a good thing in some ways, because I was listening to some interviews and they were just talking about, like, if Russia says they're going to have 2 million potatoes, they're going to have potatoes, and they're going to like run this thing like a business. And so that was to their advantage. But running it like a machine that way, it introduced a lot of inefficiencies. They kind of set these agendas like, we're going to have this many potatoes and whatever it might be. And it didn't really, there wasn't like data to back up what they wanted. So the way that their government worked, it was like a Soviet, so an individual would join a Soviet, which in Russian, that's the word for a workers' council. And then they would send representatives to the All-Russian Congress of Soviets. And obviously Russia, it's very complicated when you're looking at the government, because you have like different like little blocks of individual republics that are part of the USSR. And then they would appoint from this All-Russian Congress of Soviets people who would like make laws and people who would enforce laws. And it was, kind of good in some ways, because then they had representation, because it was supposed to be like a government run by the people and for the people. But in the end, you still had people making decisions about what the numbers of production needed to be, and the community basically deciding what was good for you, what was good for everyone else, and kind of that standard of living. And even within a system like this, where it's supposed to like somewhat equalize everybody, it didn't. You still had like hierarchies. You still had people who had like great lives, and you had people who didn't. And obviously you have like starvation and things and famines and certain things that we know of that took place historically. But it was really interesting to look at from the perspective of being there, kind of in relation to what so when we visited Vienna, Austria years ago, you don't really want to talk about Hitler and stuff there, even though the Austrians like joined him, because at that time they didn't have food, they didn't have many resources. And so when somebody comes in and says, hey, we're going to make your country awesome and you're going to have food, and they make all these promises, of course you're going to follow them. Your kids are starving and you want a job and you want food and stuff. And so it makes sense. Like, you don't want to just throw everybody under the bus and say, oh, they're all like communists and evil or something. And that's the American perspective, is that communism is evil, but like realistically, it's just like a kibbutz or a community of people working together. And I think something actually I was talking to my wife about this today was a community like that's perfect and is like seeking to, everything's in communion and everything is working together, and there's that selflessness. That's a lot like what Christianity was early on in the days in the Acts church, like having all together. Maybe not necessarily that they literally owned each other's land or anything, but so it's different from that ideology, but that
they had all things in common.
Yeah, exactly. And like that would make sense, like if you had a utopian society where humans were all, selfless and giving to each other. I mean, it makes sense from that standpoint, but you kind of lose me at socialism when they say like you don't own land, because that's something, as an American mindset, like I want to have a piece of property where I could do my own things and stuff and have some more freedom. Like in socialism, a lot of people were saying like, oh, capitalism is just like exchanging who's the slave and who's the owner for a different system from socialism. But I feel like there's a lot more freedom within capitalism or capitalist society to make some choices and to get out from like under things. Like your boss isn't just out there to like grind wheel you and just drive you into the ground and take all your resources. I mean, I don't think so. But I don't know. It was interesting to look at it from a bit of a different perspective.
Yeah, and it does seem like socialism and stuff. It feels like it works on smaller scales. So like you talked about the church and Acts, and I think in these little small microcosms, it does work. But I think when you scale it up to the national level, that's when things kind of start to fall apart. It's just not. It just doesn't really scale that well. The other big problem, I think, has to do with the underlying assumption, which is a very humanist assumption, that we are inherently good and that we're going to be looking at everyone else's best interest and not our own. But we are inherently selfish, and as Christians, we believe that there's the depravity of man. So we're not going to achieve this. Now, if we were perfect or something, maybe it would work, but that's just not the reality. I think capitalism kind of it works a little better with who we are as people, which is why it's done pretty well and it scales really well. But that's where I kind of feel like it just kind of breaks down for socialism.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely, I think in socialism, especially with Russia, it was not to their benefit in general to be very efficient, because we have the same problem in our society with our governments, but they were experiencing, it didn't make sense. It made more sense to report that you were underperforming, and just by a little bit, it was a balancing act. So you just underperform a little bit, so they allocate more resources for you to be doing a better job, and then you could actually hit your quota, and it's wow, you're doing great, and then you can keep your resources, because if you actually performed efficiently and you did produce more with little, that was to your detriment, because then they would oh, well, then you don't really need workers and resources. And we see that in our own government. That happens with the military. No police agency or military department or any part of our government in the U.S. wants to cut back and be efficient, because then the government's will be oh, you're doing fine, cut it. But that doesn't make any sense from because our state is still socialistic in its tendencies with that idea. If you were looking at from a completely business standpoint, you don't just say, oh, hey, they're doing great over here with efficiency, we're going to cut all the resources. Most time in a business standpoint, if something is very efficient and it's producing more with very little, I would pump more into it to produce even more. If you see your percentage gains there are great. Now, obviously it depends on what it is, but I don't know. I think from a capitalist standpoint, it gives you that option to do that. Whereas with the other ones, you have more reason to be lazy. So,
yeah, but with greater efficiencies, you attract investors, because an efficient business has a very high potential to perform better than its competitors. Businesses that are efficient are able to pass on savings onto the customer, and really it's just so they can bring the price down below their competitors, and therefore people are now going to be demanding their product or service over everyone else's. So it really, that does work really well. But I think corporations do suffer from this one of the same problem with coming in under budget. Most divisions are they're not going to want to come under budget because then they're going to lose that budget in the next fiscal year. So they try to vent it somehow, buying $300 toilet seats. I think that's a military thing, but they're trying to burn off some of that excess. I see it in my own industry where usually getting close to the end of a fiscal year, some customers will all of a sudden contact us and be hey, we have these projects we'd like to get kind of done real quick, or at least get the ball rolling with it, so we can kind of burn off some of this excess cash, so we don't have to, we don't have to like lower our budget for the next fiscal year. So that always works out for us. But
yeah. Now turning over to what you were wanting to talk about was the UBI. I think it's not like, obviously it's not socialism, because you're talking more about production, distribution, the all that stuff, and UBI is a different, but like in my mind it's related, because like take from one people group or you take from some people to give to everybody. Either way, it's like distributing wealth is something I'm not like generally in favor of. But what do you got?
Yeah. So UBI, or Universal Basic Income, as you talked about before. Now, this is something that's been kind of bandied about in previous decades. It's kind of undergone some evolution over the years, and it was kind of brought to the forefront of the national stage or national conversation during the Democratic primaries with one of the candidates, Andrew Yang. He had made it, I wouldn't say the foundation of his bid, but he did make it one of the foundation, or one of the pillars of it. And so that kind of brought it up. I think some people had never heard of it before, but it obviously garnered a bunch of interest. Even went so far as to use, I don't want to say he used campaign funds, but he did have some kind of thing where he was basically choosing people and giving you and doing UBI for those people for the remainder of that year or something like that. So essentially what UBI is that everyone unconditionally is to receive a certain amount of money that they can do with whatever they want. There's no conditions to it. They just get it. And the idea here is that if you're disabled, if you are out of work and you can't work, then you have this like underlying base salary that's afforded to you every month, guaranteed by the government. That's not to say that you can't work. If you wanted to, you could take a job and receive additional compensation, which would add on to your UBI compensation, and then they would just tax you on that excess. But then they were also allowing for people who just simply didn't want to work, right? As if working is just not your thing. I don't know. You would still get, this compensation. Of course, this speaks to a lot of people who doesn't want an additional X amount of money per month. And I think it started out with about $2,000, or I think Yang had said, like, what would you do with an additional $1,000 a month or something like that? But towards the end of the campaign, he was kind of suggesting that it could be as high as $4,000 or $6,000 a month. Yeah, and so obviously the how we're going to pay for that kind of comes into the conversation at that point. So I will say the proponents of UBI are not ignorant to the different problems and challenges, and they have tried to respond to some of the major concerns been brought up. Some of them I felt were decent answers. Some were kind of incomplete, and some I just don't think were ever really answered. That's kind of glozed over. So the four main things that come up, of course, is how are we going to pay for this? And then systemic corruption, responding economic forces, and then negative effect on job participation. So I'm going to revisit each of these. So how we're going to pay for it. So that was kind of one of the bigger ones. It's one of the easier kind of reflexive answers to this was just tax the rich, which is kind of ridiculous.
Take from the wealthy.
That doesn't... Yeah, well, I mean, it sounds great. I mean, it speaks well to a lot of the middle and, well, I shouldn't say middle class, but like a lot of lower class, that sounds great, just tax the rich, but you just don't understand the scale of everything. It's just not going to work. You can't just tax the rich. And if you were, I mean, they could just up and move. I think, if you remember Macron of France, when he came in, he tried to up the tax rate significantly. And a lot of the rich, they just said, like, look, we're going to move. Like, it's no big deal for us to just, move a couple 100 miles in one direction because it's Europe. They had no problem moving away. And so, it might cost a couple $1 million to have their accountants run through all their assets and move things. But I mean, like, that's kind of like, a spit in the ocean for a lot of these ultra wealthy.
And so, like, they're save. Yeah. I mean, shoo.
Yeah, exactly. So 60-70% of France's taxable income was coming from these people, and they were just like, look, we'll be gone within the year if you don't stop this. So he had to kind of like recant. So like I don't think like just taxing the rich is not really an option because they have such mobility in the world. The other thing that I thought was, at least for how to pay for this, something that was actually a little bit more of a tenable solution was to actually wrap up all other social or social safety net type programs or welfare type programs. So welfare, Social Security, WIC, food stamps, Medicare, Medicaid, just take all of that away and consolidate all of its funding into UBI. Also kind of rolling up all of its bureaucracy and workers and then kind of downsizing it essentially into that. So that actually solved a couple of problems. It's somewhat of an elegant proposal to answer the how we're going to pay for it question, which, because UBI is pretty streamlined in that it's unconditional, everyone gets it, then the bureaucrats can then just kind of focus just on, making sure that everyone gets something and that no one's cheating the system. One of the problems, though, that someone brought up, I remember reading a kind of a response to rolling up all these social programs into one UBI program, was that Medicare and Medicaid actually constituted a very, very big benefit to people, and that to take that away would eclipse whatever benefit they got from UBI. And so they're saying you'd have to keep that to some degree, but that was also a pretty big, money sink. So like it's kind of difficult to reconcile the two. So you almost have to roll up all the other social programs and tax the rich to some degree. So that's where I'm not entirely sure how that's going to work when faced with those kinds of that kind of reality.
Which the next thing to do makes sense, like if you consolidate those things and because like obviously the problem isn't just in that they don't have enough money to afford these things, but also that some of those services cost too much to some degree,
right?
And I'm not like in favor in general of like, hey, you have to cost less in like whatever it is, like food service or healthcare, but it does seem that people are very aware that healthcare and insurance and all the practices there doesn't make any sense. Like something's wrong with that system. So maybe you could, but that's like a lot of reform and a lot of change. It'd be really hard to pull off all of that and figure what's wrong. So
it does peel back a little bit and exposes a problem with the medical insurance industry itself, because Medicare and Medicaid is such a big deal. Because it saves people so much money. It's like, okay, well, that means that the medical insurance industry has a real issue, which I think we've known that. I'm just not sure that everyone, the people in charge, are capable of coming up with a solution to it. They didn't with Obamacare; has kind of doubled down on it. But anyways, so if you were to solve the medical insurance industry, then maybe Medicare and Medicaid wouldn't be that big of an impact, and you could realistically roll that up into UBI. But now you have two different problems, and when you have to solve one before the other, and the medical insurance issue is going to be way too much to have to deal with. The next thing is system corruption. So this one kind of was like when you're looking at like welfare, like the amount of people that kind of game the system there, which isn't as much. But it still exists. With UBI, it would be a little easier because it's such a streamlined type system, and because it's unconditional. You can focus on, making sure that only one person gets their UBI benefits. I guess one way to game the system would be if you had a relative who died and you kind of like tried to hide the death certificate or something like that to kind of continue to get their checks added to you.
I wonder if that'd be like a market based around like trading cards, like dead people, and like you like I'll give you this person for this amount of money, and like you have this set like $1,000 per month, like you can buy an extra. I wonder. I don't know. That'd be like really weird. Of course, you have to deal with like illegal immigrants or things like that, like non-citizens and stuff. So, who gets it?
If the bureaucracy is kind of more like reduced and streamlined, they can focus on death record reconciliation. Kind of keeping up with that to help stamp out stuff like that. I'm sure black markets would arise somehow, right? But then they could hopefully sort that out. So I thought that was a decent answer to that point. The next one I think this is the big one, the responding economic forces. So this is essentially inflation. If businesses or landlords know that every one of their tenants, every one of their customers has an additional $4,000, $6,000 every single month, there's nothing really to stop them from just increasing their costs. Like, we're just going to make this product, cost more. Or I'm going to raise your rent because I know you got the money. You were affording this before. Now you have an additional $4,000, $5,000, whatever. I can just raise it, not by the full amount, but they can still get a piece of that.
Yeah. I think Andre Geek actually did a video about like why UBI doesn't work and focused on like what if you gave everybody $1 million and everybody woke up like with $1 million. If you had it in your bank account, or if you don't have a bank account and you just found it under a tree or something like that, the problem is suddenly that you'd have everything would become suddenly more expensive to match like that supply and demand factor, because like you just taking money and just making it less valuable, which they have in like Yugoslavia and Botswana or Zimbabwe and other countries where like they have to print it in higher denominations because the smaller denominations aren't as valuable because everybody just has a bunch of it. And I think some of that would come into play, inflation, hyperinflation, and things like that.
Yeah, and so, I mean, and some people will say like, so like the response, the counter to that was like, oh, well, that's just not going to happen. So that was kind of like a hand wave, magic wand. I was like, I don't.
We don't listen to history here.
Yeah, yeah, but like it felt like really simple economics. Unless I was missing something very obvious, but I mean, like I just don't see it not happening. The only like recourse would be like government regulation on a free market to say like, well, we're going to fix price all this stuff, or you rent freeze, which they kind of have in New York to some degree, and it's like I just don't know, that's not going to work at the national stage. And the thing is, we've seen it happen with student loan debt, right? Mm-hmm. So colleges and universities, once it was revealed, or I guess when the government said, "Hey, we're going to subsidize student loans, or we're going to offer these federal backed student loan type things." Well, the colleges and universities now knew that all their students had access to federal, loans. And so like, well, they got more money, we're going to increase tuition. Again, they were able to afford tuition before. Now they have access to more money. They could just borrow more, and we want a piece of that. So they would take it, right? So these things, the tuition kept rising over time until students could no longer afford it. And then the government said like, oh, we can't have that. Let's offer them more money. We'll now authorize more money for them to borrow.
So is that like also that the colleges, when they accept government-funded students, that there are certain implications that the college has to take on as far as like certain things that it has to commit to doing? So maybe they're also raising, besides like wanting a bigger piece of the pie and making more money for their shareholders or board or whatever, like there might have been other things that like, well, they had to spend more money on now?
I'm not entirely sure. I mean, so when they when you get a student loan, though, I mean, government is just a lender at that point. And so they're like, here's your money for college. And I think the lender in the government pays the university or college on your behalf to pay the tuition bill.
I remember the college I went to, like they talked a lot about like they didn't accept any government like funding type of things for like student loans or things like that. Like you couldn't get any loans from government stuff because it brought in government regulation. Like I think people had mentioned that. And I know that they didn't accept it, but I don't really know the implications there of like what that actually affects.
Yeah, I don't know what the strings are that get attached if they accept that, because there is some things where like a university or some kind of education system, they will get some kind of government assistance, and I think that's where the regulations come in. But when it comes to like student tuition, I don't know if that's the same. But yeah, we could probably look into that more. But I mean, still the idea that if they know you have more money to spend, or you could have access to more money, either we're just going to increase the prices to get a piece of that. It would be, from a business standpoint, it'd be kind of dumb not to do that. I mean, your board would be all over you. Like, why aren't you taking advantage of this? It's nothing personal. It's just good business. So the last thing also is the negative effect on job participation. So in this one, the fear is if no one has to work, how many people are going to choose not to work? And now we have a drastically reduced job market, and so now like there's not enough people, and so there's not enough job participation. So now businesses have to incentivize hiring people. Like they're going to have to increase the salaries offered, and then they're just going to pass that expense on to the consumer by raising prices on things. So that kind of, and I didn't really see a good answer to that. There wasn't really a good rebuttal either. Is like we don't really know what that would look like. We don't know how many people would simply choose not to work. There may be a decent amount that would choose not to work, but $6,000 a month isn't a fantastic amount of money for a lifestyle that many people probably want, and so a lot of people would probably choose to at least pick up a part-time job. or something to supplement their, their annual income, just so they can have a better quality of life.
If it was definitely along the lines of like 1,000 to 2,000, I could see you'd have to basically still work. But if it was like 5 to 6,000, like if that's saying that hyperinflation didn't happen or there wasn't like fallout from it, $5,000 to $6,000. I mean, that would replace my income easily, like well more than my income, and then I wouldn't have to work. But I mean, I'm a kind of person who like wants to make progress and create and build and things, and so I would still do that. But I could think of several people that I know of, like, well, they would probably just like stop, because that's like 3 times more than they actually make in a month, and they're living the rich life at that point. So
yeah, so I think, like, and there's just a lot that goes into that, like an economical analysis to figure out like how many people would stop working. I mean, yeah, you're right. If they had like $5,000 or $6,000 a month, like, well, that's about the point where a lot of people like, look, that's about as much as I make now, or more. So like, I'm not going to work, or they would still choose to work. But like, there's some people that was like, look, that's plenty. Like that completely satisfies my lifestyle, and I just don't have to work. I'm going to do that. So. Yeah, I just don't know what that actually looks like. How many people would participate in the job market if they had that kind of money? And I guess it would depend on how much would be offered per month in UBI.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you haven't guessed, I'm not exactly a proponent of UBI. While I don't think it is the solution, I do think it is a solution to a very real problem. And this is kind of what Andrew Yang had kind of formed around his reasoning for UBI. Was around the fact that automation is a very real threat to a lot of people's jobs. And AI and automation was going to just take a lot of people's jobs. And that UBI was the only real solution that we even have on the table that would solve it. And some people would say like, oh, well, that's way off in the future. That's like 10, 20 years off in the future. Well, really, it's not. I mean, we've got a lot of stuff that's already being automated. I mean, McDonald's has already successfully prototyped a store that's fully automated. I mean, you can walk in, order off a kiosk, and get your food like prepped fresh, packaged, cooked, packaged, and then presented to you without having to interact with a human. We've already got like Google 15 years ago had cars running up, self-driving cars running up and down the coast, and they had no accidents. There was like 4 or 5 incidences that were related, but all of those were someone else hitting the self-driving car, and the one that was the self-driving car's fault was because the human riding in the passenger seat took control and then ran it into something. So I mean, really, that's a pretty good track record. I mean, like in terms of like it performing well and being safe, and that did it for several years. We had a semi-truck a couple year or two ago. Semi-truck went from coast to coast without any human intervention. Amazon employs, I shouldn't say employs, but they have robots that run around their warehouses and do like picking and filling orders and then packaging them into trucks. And then if you think about it from like start to finish, you could have, robots be doing all that, packing trucks. The trucks are automated, take it to the different warehouses, unpacked by robots, repacked into other cars, then driven self-driving cars to your house and dropping off. I mean, we're looking at like a massive amount of jobs just disappearing with the automation just with the automation stuff that we know of today. There is probably more that's already in development that's probably nearing maturity, and we just don't know about it. So, I mean, and it's getting better. If you remember Amazon, when you would get a package from Amazon, they would used to ask you, like, hey, how was the packaging? That feedback was to train their machine learning models, because they had machines that were packaging these things up, and they needed feedback. Did this package right? Was it too big? Was it too small?
I wish I'd known that. I would have put in some, false data for the fun of it.
Yeah.
Package it like a fish, please.
Just mess with them. Yeah. So I mean, like, it's been learning. I'm sure what they were doing is they were probably carefully watching all of their workers as they were doing packaging and picking and stuff, and learning from them doing that in order to replace them at one point. So all that to say, like, I really think that a lot of these jobs are going to get taken away. And in the past, it's always been this thing where, like when the automobile came out, like people who shoed horses or made stagecoaches and all that kind of stuff. I mean, like those jobs would disappear, but we had the automobile, so now that created a bunch of jobs. Well, that may not happen this time, because the jobs that are being eliminated by automation and AI, and the jobs that are being created by it, then are also jobs that the automation and AI can do, right?
Yeah, they're like not even like on the same par, because like you have, if you're getting rid of like the stereotypical burger flipper at McDonald's and a cashier and stuff, they can't suddenly switch over to like line working because we already have automation
exactly.
there. And going to repair and technology sector, like that's probably for most of those people, that's like a career shift and like an educational thing that has to happen to like a great degree to go into advanced AI, machine learning, programming type of stuff that's needed now.
But I've heard people say, "Oh, well, they'll just get a job in technology." It's like, okay, really? I mean, like, if they've been doing manufacturing for 30 years and all of a sudden they have no job, like how many months or how many years is it going to take for that person to retrain and then get a job in the technology sector? I mean, I just don't see that happening. It's going to take a while, and in that time, will they survive on the savings they have? And if you've seen reports, like a decent amount of people, the majority of Americans are like one paycheck away from going bankrupt or something, right? They're just living paycheck to paycheck. They've got all this debt and they're just really tied down and they can't afford to lose their job. It was one of the problems we had with the pandemic. People are like, look, I have to work. I can't just stay home. I have to go to work because I cannot afford to miss a paycheck. And they're having to choose, and that was actually, that was what UBI proponents brought up. As a reminder, like, hey, reminder, this would have been avoided if we had UBI. But, so I don't know. I don't think UBI is really a tenable solution. Maybe on the short term. I mean, if we're talking about people who have lost their jobs, they need like a couple months or a year, maybe UBI can work for them there, but then that kind of complicates some things. And it's not exactly what UBI proponents want. So I don't know.
I mean,
I just think that the automation AI is a problem.
Yeah. I mean, that definitely is a case, and I don't think it's like the UBI thing is going to be a good solution, like for a long-term problem. I think there needs to be more diversification, like because our society is so consumerist-driven and entertainment-driven at this point, and you can't have a entertainment like economy. It doesn't work that way. And so you have to have some level of people being able to be self-sufficient and gardening, farming, things like that. You need those things. And maybe if an economic collapse or something kind of happened, people would move more out to the country and have to learn, subsistence living to some degree. But I don't know. I don't know that we're going to I don't think our government is going to allow, and the people communally, like in our somewhat socialist society, like are going to allow for that to happen. So I don't know, maybe there'll be a better option in the future. I don't agree with just giving money to everybody because principally that is going to not work in the long run. But we do need to talk about like where to put these people in technology, like, or in other fields that are going to be eliminated at some point.
And I think it also kind of robs people of purpose, which is it can be a very demoralizing thing. Can probably lead to a lot of depression. I mean, I feel like if you want, we find purpose like in working, and maybe that sounds a little kind of dumb, but I mean, like, honestly, like, a lot of people do find purpose in their lives through what they do. And having a job, being self-sufficient, having responsibilities are all things that can really help make your life feel a lot better and more purposeful. So like, just giving people money just to kind of like live off of the state, I think it sounds really good for a little bit, but I think people would become depressed after a while.
Maybe
or they'd feel so dependent.
And then those who lose their jobs can go live there. And then
in a fantasy world within their mind.
Oh, I don't know.
Wow.
Sounds like a bad idea, but at the same time it also sounds like a good solution.
Hey.
It's like gives them something to do, and then they can like do whatever they want and feel like they have purpose, and like, it's completely programmed in, like whatever.
Yeah.
But I don't know. So there you go. UBI, interesting thought experiment.
Yeah.
Probably not a long-term solution to pull off, but we'll see what happens. But, anything else got on that? Are you all set?
Nope. That's all I've got.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us on Escape News Podcast. Remember, like, subscribe, comment, leave a review on podcasts. Check out our Patreon, and then go check us out on Rumble, where we'll have afterburners over there now. Discussions after the main show, and we'll see you guys next week.